The first time the lights flickered, I didn't think much of it. Could have been a loose wire, maybe a storm messing with the grid. But when it happened again the next night, and then again the night after that, I knew something was off. I was in my barn, finishing up for the evening, when the power cut out completely for a solid 2 seconds before snapping back on. My prize cow, Bessie, let out an irritated moo, glaring at me like this was somehow my fault. "Yeah, I know, girl," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "Not my idea, either." This was the third time in a week. Something was draining my electricity, and it wasn't just the occasional flicker. My utility bill had shot up too. I wasn't running anything new, no extra heaters, no new equipment. And yet every time I checked the meter, the numbers were running like a damn marathon. I sighed, ran a hand through my hair, and headed outside to check the breaker box. Maybe something was shorting out. Maybe some rodent had chewed through a wire. I was expecting to find a problem. Instead, I found a mystery. The moment I stepped onto my porch, I saw it. An orange extension cord. It slithered like a neon snake across my yard, stretching from my barn, over the fence, and straight into my neighbor's house. My jaw tightened. My fists clenched. That was Karen's house. Of all the people on this planet, of all the neighbors it could have been, it had to be her. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Karen, the woman who had spent the last 2 years making my life hell over nonsense rules she had no authority to enforce. Karen, who had once left a note in my mailbox because my grass was too tall by half an inch. And now, she was stealing my electricity. I stood there, staring at that extension cord, trying to wrap my head around the sheer audacity of this woman. I wasn't even in the HOA. My farm wasn't under their jurisdiction. That had never stopped her from harassing me about my unkempt property and unapproved farm animals. She was the kind of person who would take a ruler to measure your lawn and issue a warning if it was a millimeter too long. The kind who sent mass emails about the integrity of the neighborhood if someone dared to park their truck in the driveway instead of the garage. And now, this woman, this walking, talking HOA citation, was literally stealing my power. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. I wanted to march over there, yank that extension cord out of the socket, and throw it over the fence. I wanted to bang on her door and ask her if she had lost her damn mind. But that wouldn't be enough. No. If I was going to deal with Karen, I needed proof. Storming over there and confronting her wouldn't accomplish anything except giving her an excuse to twist the story and make herself the victim. No, I needed cold, undeniable evidence. I needed to catch her in the act. So I did what any self-respecting farmer with a grudge would do. I set a trap. That night, I set up one of my hunting cameras inside the barn, positioned perfectly to catch anyone sneaking in. Then, I waited. Morning came, and the first thing I did was check the footage. I hit play, and within seconds, my blood pressure spiked. There she was, Karen, dressed in overpriced yoga pants, and one of those obnoxious bedazzled hoodies that said, "Live, Laugh, Love," in all caps across the front, sneaking onto my property, dragging her cursed extension cord across my land, like a damn burglar with an electrical fetish. I watched as she looked around nervously, as if she were some kind of master thief pulling off the heist of the century. Then, she plugged in. And just like that, her house was powered by my farm. I sat back, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. The sheer nerve of this woman. Oh, Karen, you have no idea what you just started. I could have just gone over there, unplugged the cord and been done with it. But that wouldn't have been satisfying. Karen loved rules. She worshipped them. She quoted HOA bylaws like they were scripture. If she had her way, this whole neighborhood would be under military-grade regulations. So, if she wanted to play the HOA game, fine, I'd play along, but we'd be playing by my rules. I sat down at my desk, cracked my knuckles, and got to work. First, I pulled up some official-sounding legal documents online, HOA policies, city ordinances, anything with lots of fancy legal jargon. Then, I started writing. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that unauthorized power consumption has been detected at your residence. Under Farm Utility Homeowners Association, FUHA, Bylaws, Section 12.5, Subsection B, all non-compliant electricity use is subject to immediate penalties. Current assessed fees, $10,000. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will result in additional consequences, including but not limited to power disconnection, lien placement on your property, legal action under the FAA Compliance Act. Please make immediate payment to FUHA to avoid further escalation. Sincerely, FUHA Compliance Office. I sat back and looked at my masterpiece. It was perfect. But I wasn't done yet. I had my buddy Tim, who used to work in a law office, format the document properly, adding official-looking stamps, letterhead, and a big, bold final notice in red ink. Then, just to really sell it, I had a custom envelope printed with the FUHA logo I completely made up, slapped on an urgent stamp, and scheduled a professional delivery service to drop it off at Karen's house. If she loved HOA authority so much, she was about to get a taste of it. The next morning, I poured myself a big cup of coffee and stepped onto my porch, waiting for the show to begin. And oh, it did not disappoint. At exactly 9:13 a.m., the delivery guy pulled up, hopped out, and placed the letter right on Karen's front porch. 2 minutes later, her front door swung open. There she stood, in her floral robe and fuzzy slippers, looking like she had just woken up from a dream where she was still in charge of the neighborhood. She bent down, picked up the letter, and flipped it over in her hands. Suspicion flickered across her face, but she still opened it. And then, the magic happened. Her expression changed, her posture stiffened. Her face went pale. Her mouth dropped open, then snapped shut. For a long, glorious moment, she just stood there, staring at the paper like it was a court summons. Then, like I had just detonated a bomb in her world, she let out a shriek so loud it probably knocked 3 years off my life expectancy. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. She spun around, clutching the letter to her chest, and bolted inside. I could only imagine what was going through her head. Had she really broken an HOA rule without knowing? Impossible. She knew every rule. She enforced them. Had she been reported to an authority higher than the HOA? Unthinkable. She was supposed to be the authority. I leaned back in my chair, sipped my coffee, and enjoyed every second of it. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Oh, I knew exactly who that was. I let it ring. No voicemail. That meant she was either too panicked to think straight, or already plotting her next move. I glanced over at her house. Through the front window, I could see her pacing, phone in one hand, letter in the other. She was sweating. And then, just as I predicted, she went into full-blown crisis mode. Within an hour, she had printed out a stack of papers, probably trying to cross-reference every HOA document in existence to prove FUHA wasn't real. Within 2 hours, she had rallied her troops. I heard them before I saw them. Karen had an army, a small group of middle-aged HOA warriors assembled in her driveway, all clutching their own stacks of documents like they were preparing to go to court. Karen was leading them, of course. And then, like a commander leading her troops into battle, she marched up to my gate, letter in hand, fury in her eyes. I stepped outside, keeping my face as neutral as possible. "Afternoon, Karen," I said, pretending not to notice the storm of rage brewing behind her eyes. Something wrong? She thrust the letter toward me. "Do you have any idea what this is?" she snapped. I took it, pretended to read it, then nodded. "Looks like a power bill." I scratched my chin. "Steep one too." Her eye twitched. "This is a scam." She spat the words like they burned her mouth. "There is no such thing as the Farm Utility Homeowners Association." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? Says right there on the letter that there is." Her minions shifted uncomfortably. One of them, Patricia, hesitated. "I mean, if it's an official notice." Karen whipped around, glaring at Patricia so hard, the poor woman took a step back. "It's not official, it's a scam." I sighed, shaking my head. Karen. If it's a scam, why did you get the letter?" She stiffened. Did you? I don't know. Plug into someone else's electricity." For one glorious moment, she froze. She knew I knew. The color drained from her face, just for a second, before she recovered and puffed herself up like an angry peacock. "That is a ridiculous accusation," she snapped. "I would never—" I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. And there it was, the footage. Karen, in her bedazzled hoodie, sneaking onto my property, plugging in that damn extension cord. Her minions turned toward her. The silence was delicious. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and crossed my arms. "Look, Karen," I said, sighing. "I'd hate to escalate this, but this—" I gestured to the letter in her hand. "This is serious business. Maybe you should just pay the bill and move on." Her nostrils flared. "I am not paying a fake power bill." I shrugged. "Well, then I guess Fuha will have no choice but to take action." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. She had lost, but Karen never accepted defeat. And I wasn't done yet. Karen stormed back to her house, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't take L's. Not gracefully, anyway. She had spent years bossing people around with HOA rules, weaponizing bureaucratic nonsense against anyone who dared to live outside of her absurdly strict standards. She was relentless when it came to enforcing neighborhood order. But this time, she was the one in violation. And that had to be eating her alive. I kept an eye on her house from my porch. Within minutes, she was pacing again, the letter still clutched in her hands. She picked up her phone, dialed, stopped, redialed. I could just imagine her thought process. She couldn't call the HOA, because this wasn't a real HOA issue. She couldn't ignore it, because ignoring official HOA notices was against everything she stood for. And she definitely couldn't admit guilt, because Karen was never wrong. So she did the next best thing in her mind. She called for backup. Over the next hour, she made several calls. Whatever she was up to, she was assembling a plan. Then came the reinforcements. One by one, Karen's HOA loyalists began arriving at her house. First Patricia, who always looked nervous, but never had the spine to stand up to Karen. Then Lydia, the HOA treasurer, who carried a 3-inch thick binder of HOA regulations everywhere she went. Finally, the old guy from down the street, Howard, who barely spoke but showed up to every HOA meeting, just to glare at people. They gathered on Karen's porch like a war council preparing for battle. I could see Karen talking, gesturing wildly, showing them the letter, pointing in my direction. Lydia flipped through her binder, nodding like she was searching for some kind of legal loophole. Patricia just wrung her hands. They were plotting. And then, like an army marching to the battlefield, they headed straight for my house. I stayed exactly where I was, leaning against my porch railing, coffee in hand, looking as relaxed as possible. Karen, however, looked like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She shoved the letter toward me again. "You listen to me, Jake," she snapped, her voice sharp and clipped. "This is fraud. This so-called HOA doesn't exist." I took the letter, looked it over again like I'd never seen it before, and nodded. "Sure looks official to me." Karen's eye twitched. Lydia cleared her throat. "Jake, we checked the HOA records. There is no mention of a Farm Utility Homeowners Association anywhere in our documentation." I gave them a slow, exaggerated nod. "That's probably because HOA is a separate organization," I said. "It handles power regulation compliance for properties in agricultural zones." Patricia blinked. Karen jabbed a finger at me. "That's not a real thing." I shrugged. "Are you sure?" Lydia hesitated. She flipped through her binder, scanning through pages, but found nothing. That's when I saw it, the first crack in the foundation of Karen's confidence. Karen had spent years memorizing HOA rules, bending them to control the neighborhood. But for the first time, she was up against a rule she didn't know. She was lost. And worse, her own followers were doubting her. Patricia bit her lip. "I mean, if this came in an official letter, maybe it's real." Karen spun around so fast Patricia physically recoiled. "It's not real," she shrieked. "This is a scam." Howard, the old guy, crossed his arms. "Then why'd you get the letter?" Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I sighed dramatically, shaking my head. Karen. I'd hate to escalate this, but failure to pay HOA-assessed power violations can result in some serious consequences. Karen stiffened. I pulled out a second piece of paper and held it up. "See, I just got a follow-up notice from FUHA. I handed it to her. It was a completely fabricated audit report, but it looked real. Karen snatched it from my hand and read it. Her face turned red. "This is ridiculous," she growled. "It says my house has been drawing more power than any other in the neighborhood." I nodded. "That's because you stole power, Karen." Silence. Her followers took a step back. Karen was fumbling. She was cornered. And then she did what Karen always did when she started losing. She doubled down. "This is harassment," she hissed. "I could sue you for this." I shrugged. "Go ahead, but you might want to settle your HOA fees first. Otherwise your power might get disconnected." That set her off. Her face twisted with fury. "You can't cut off my power." I pointed at the notice. "Says right there in the letter." Karen let out a strangled noise somewhere between a growl and a scream. And then she stormed off, back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Lydia, Patricia, and Howard stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they left. I took another sip of my coffee, watching as Karen's HOA empire crumbled in real time. But I wasn't done yet, because tomorrow morning, she was getting a visit from the FUHA compliance inspector. And oh boy, was it going to be good. The next morning I sat on my porch with my coffee, waiting. Karen had been suspiciously quiet since our last encounter. No threats, no emails, no fake HOA fines mysteriously appearing in my mailbox. Which meant only one thing: she was plotting something. But what Karen didn't know was that I had already planned my next move. Right on schedule, at 8:45 a.m., a car pulled up in front of her house. It wasn't just any car. It was Tim. Wearing his best cheap suit, glasses perched at the edge of his nose, holding a clipboard so full of nonsense paperwork it looked intimidating as hell. Tim had never worked as a real inspector, but he had worked in a law office before, and more importantly, he could fake confidence like a pro. With an air of absolute authority, he strode up to Karen's house and rang the doorbell 3 times. The response was immediate. I heard shuffling, then rapid footsteps, and within seconds Karen yanked the door open. She looked rough, like she hadn't slept all night, probably because she'd been up frantically researching FUHA, calling every HOA contact she had, and hitting dead end after dead end. And now here was a man in a suit with a clipboard, standing on her doorstep, looking extremely official. Tim adjusted his glasses. "Good morning, ma'am." He cleared his throat. "I'm here to conduct an official compliance review regarding unauthorized power usage under the Farm Utility Homeowners Association." Karen's entire body stiffened. The what?" Tim sighed, as if he had explained this too many times already. "The Farm Utility Homeowners Association, ma'am. You should have received a notice." Karen clutched the letter to her chest like a lifeline. "This is a scam," she snapped. "I don't owe anyone $10,000. Tim flipped through his clipboard, nodding as if reading some crucial information. "Well, ma'am," he said, tapping the paper. "According to our records, your property has been consuming an unauthorized amount of electricity. That places you in violation of subsection B, Article 12, which, as you know, carries significant penalties." Karen's face twitched. She didn't know. She hated not knowing. That's ridiculous," she stammered. "I don't even—" She stopped, because denying it wasn't an option anymore. She had seen the footage. She knew I had her. Instead, she switched tactics. "This is harassment," she hissed. "I'll sue you." Tim didn't even blink. "Ma'am, you are free to pursue legal action." He adjusted his clipboard. "However, given that you've already been documented in non-compliance, I'd strongly advise against it. The penalties for power theft are steep." Karen let out a frustrated growl. "I didn't steal anything." Tim clicked his pen and started writing. "Noted." Karen snatched at the clipboard, but Tim pulled it back effortlessly. "You can't just show up here and threaten me," she fumed. "I have rights." Tim nodded. "Absolutely. And we have an obligation to enforce compliance. At this point, we have no choice but to escalate the matter." Karen's expression flickered with something close to fear. "Escalate how?" Tim flipped to another page on his clipboard. "Well," he said, scanning it with the seriousness of a federal investigator, "if payment is not received within 72 hours, your property will be subject to immediate power disconnection. Following that, a lien may be placed on your home for the outstanding balance." Karen's face went pale. "You can't cut off my power." Tim glanced casually at her front yard, where her ridiculous pink flamingo lawn ornaments stood in formation. "I see you have decorative lighting," he mused. "Those will, of course, also be affected." Karen looked like she might actually pass out. "This is insane," she shrieked. Tim nodded. "So, just to clarify, you're refusing to pay?" Karen sputtered, flailing her arms. "I'm not paying for something that isn't real." Tim pursed his lips. "Well, in that case." He pulled a bright orange notice from his clipboard and slapped it against her door. Karen yelped like he had just thrown a bucket of ice water on her. "What is that?" Tim adjusted his glasses. "Official disconnection notice." He tapped it. "You'll want to make arrangements before the deadline." Karen snatched the paper off her door, reading it with wide, panicked eyes. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Then, like a feral animal, she bolted inside and slammed the door. Tim walked back toward me, keeping his expression completely professional. The second he stepped onto my porch, he grinned. "She's losing it." I laughed, shaking my head. That was a damn fine performance. Tim took a sip from the beer I handed him, glanced back at Karen's house. "Think she'll actually pay?" I shook my head. Not a chance. But that wasn't the point. The real electric company showed up 2 days later. Not for me. Apparently, Karen had tried to call them, thinking she could prove the bill was fake. Instead, they did an inspection of their own. And that's when things really fell apart for her. Turns out, tampering with power lines is a big deal. She didn't get a $10,000 fine. She got a $25,000 fine. She stood on her front lawn, screaming at the technician, flailing her arms like a lunatic. Her husband, Greg, stood behind her, looking like he wanted to disappear. Greg rubbed his temples. "Karen, you did this to yourself." Karen spun on him like a wild animal. "You're supposed to be on my side, Greg." Greg threw his hands up. "I told you not to plug into the damn farm." The technician sighed. "Ma'am, this is an official violation. You're lucky the state isn't pressing criminal charges." Karen let out a noise somewhere between a growl and a whimper. And then, to top it all off, when she stormed inside and slammed her door, one of her stupid flamingos tipped over. Greg just stood there for a moment, sighed, and walked off in the opposite direction. A week later, the HOA held a meeting. Karen tried to get them to help cover the fines. They refused. By the end of the month, she had resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. "I never got my $10,000. But I did get the best entertainment of my life. And to celebrate, I put up a brand new sign in my barn, headquarters of the Farm Utility Homeowners Association, just in case Karen ever got any more ideas."